the narrator of the mist. The mist in Havenridge had always been a quiet companion, clinging to the hills like a secretive whisper. Most mornings, Alex Harper, a native of this isolated town, found himself walking through it as if it were a part of him, a haze that seemed to muffle the world into something softer, more mysterious. But today was different. The mist was thick, almost suffocating, crawling along the ground like a living thing. It curled around lampposts, wove through the streets, and even the trees in the surrounding woods seemed to bow under its weight. Alex, wrapped in his worn coat and scarf, stepped out onto his porch, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The chill in the air was biting, but it was the oppressive quiet that unsettled him. Usually, there would be a distant murmur of life, cars rumbling down Main Street, the faint chatter of the townsfolk, the caw of a bird perched on the edge of the pines. But now, there was nothing. The whole town seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. He squinted into the haze. There was something almost unnatural about the way the fog blanketed everything. It wasn't just the weather, it felt as though the mist itself was watching, waiting. In the distance, he thought he saw a figure, a shadow, no more than a blur against the swirling gray. Alex hesitated. He hadn't seen anyone else on his walk this morning, and the thought of encountering another soul in the series silence sent a shiver down his spine. Still, curiosity tugged at him, and before he could talk himself out of it, he found his feet moving forward. The further he went, the thicker the fog seemed to get, until even the end of the street was swallowed by it. His footsteps were muffled, but a strange sound lingered in the air, a faint, almost imperceptible hum, like a distant conversation. As Alex pressed on, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. It wasn't just the fog now. There was something else in the air, something that didn't belong. He stopped at the edge of the forest that bordered the town, where the trees were thick and ancient. The fog, heavy and damp, rolled around the trunks like smoke, curling up and around, as though it were alive. For a moment, Alex stood there, unsure whether to take the next step. But then, the sound came again. "Help me." The voice was weak, barely a whisper, but it sliced through the fog and settled deep in his chest. It didn't sound like it was coming from a single direction, but from everywhere at once, layered, distant, and close. He took a step back, heart pounding, but curiosity once again gripped him. "Who's there?" Alex called, his voice breaking the stillness. The voice came again, clearer this time. "Help me." The words weren't desperate, but the tone, quiet and broken, was enough to draw him forward. It was the kind of voice that spoke of pain, of sorrow, of someone who had given up hope long ago. The kind of voice that Alex could not ignore. He stepped forward into the woods, the cool earth beneath his boots soft and forgiving. The trees seemed to bend and twist with the fog, and with each step, the world around him grew darker. The sun, if it was even present, was blocked by the heavy mist, and the world became a shadowy, indistinct place. Yet the voice persisted, calling from somewhere deeper in the woods, guiding him through the labyrinth of trees. A sense of dread settled over him like a blanket, but he couldn't stop himself. His feet carried him forward, drawn by the voice, until he entered a small clearing. At the center of it sat an old bench, weathered and covered with moss. The figure of a man sat hunched upon it, his face obscured by a dark hood. The mist swirled around him, forming a veil that made his features indistinct. For a moment, Alex stood frozen, staring at the figure, unsure of what to do. The air felt thicker now, charged with something unseen. His heart raced, yet he couldn't turn away. The man's head lifted slowly, and despite the distance, Alex could see the faintest glint of something, eyes, perhaps, underneath the hood. "Come closer," the man said, his voice soft but unmistakably inviting. There was something familiar in his tone, something that tugged at the edges of Alex's memory. He didn't move immediately. His mind told him to turn back, to forget this madness. But his feet were already moving, against his better judgment. As he closed the distance, Alex's breath hitched. The man's eyes, black as coal, were now visible. They glowed faintly, an unnatural gleam that was both unsettling and hypnotic. Alex stopped just a few feet from him, feeling as though the air had turned to ice. "You've come," the man said, almost as if in approval. "You can hear it now, can't you?" "The call?" Alex swallowed hard, his throat dry. He nodded once, though he couldn't find the words. Something about the voice, something about the whole situation, had brought him to the edge of something that felt ancient, dangerous, and all too real. The man smiled faintly, the corners of his lips curling up in an expression that was almost knowing. He reached into the folds of his coat and pulled out a book. It was old, its leather cracked and fraying at the edges. He held it out, the book's weight seemingly pulling the air around them. "This is the ledger," the man said quietly. "A record of the lost." Alex reached out instinctively, his fingers brushing the worn cover. He felt a strange pulse of energy surge through him at the contact, as though the book itself had a life of its own. He gripped it tightly, pulling it into his arms, its weight growing heavier by the second. The weight of the old book felt wrong in Alex's hands, its surface smooth, yet ancient. As if it carried secrets that could change the very nature of his being. The man's dark eyes never left him, a knowing gaze that seemed to pierce through the mist itself. A shiver ran down Alex's spine as he felt an unfamiliar tension in the air. It was like standing on the edge of a precipice, too close to something dangerous, yet unable to turn away. "You can feel it, can't you?" the man asked, his voice barely more than a whisper, yet it echoed in the quiet of the mist. "The pull of the past, the forgotten things that call to you from the shadows." Alex wanted to say something, to speak, to question the strange man before him, but his mouth had gone dry. His mind struggled to grasp what was happening. He had come out here to walk in the mist, to clear his thoughts, not to stumble into a scene from some old ghost story. And yet here he was, standing before someone who spoke as if he knew everything about him, his fears, his regrets, and even the things he couldn't bring himself to remember. The man's eyes softened, just slightly, and he nodded as if reading Alex's thoughts. "You are afraid. But you have already crossed the line. You've heard the call, and now you must know the story." Alex felt a chill wrap itself around him. The book in his hands felt heavier still, its worn edges digging into his palms, as if urging him to open it, to read its pages. But there was something else there, something darker than mere curiosity. The fog swirling around them seemed to shift, moving in time with the man's words. "What is it?" Alex asked, his voice barely a whisper, lost among the soundless world they now inhabited. "What is the story?" The man's lips curled into a faint smile, but it wasn't a smile that conveyed warmth. It was the smile of someone who had seen too much, someone who understood the futility of certain things. "The story," the man said slowly, "is not one of joy or of hope. It's a story of endings, of things lost and things forgotten. A story of those who remain, trapped between worlds, waiting to be remembered or erased forever." The weight of his words lingered in the air like the mist itself, thick and suffocating. Alex could barely breathe. The forest around him seemed to grow quieter, more oppressive, as though the very earth were holding its breath. The man continued, his voice growing softer, almost imperceptible against the stillness. "You're not just standing in the mist, Alex. You are standing at the crossroads of something much larger. There is a thin veil here, a boundary between worlds. Some of those who walk this path never return. But you," he paused, his eyes glinting in the dim light, "you're different. You've been called. This is where your journey begins." Alex's heart began to race. The fog thickened, and the clearing around them seemed to warp and twist, the edges of reality becoming blurred. He felt the urge to step back, to leave, to forget this entire encounter. But there was a pull, a deep, unsettling pull, that held him in place. The man rose from the bench, moving slowly as if he had all the time in the world. He took a step toward Alex, the mist parting for him like a curtain being drawn aside. "This is not a story of heroes or villains," the man said softly, "but a story of choices. You can choose to walk away. You can choose to turn your back and forget everything you've seen here. But there is one thing you must understand." His voice dropped lower, almost to a whisper. Not all stories are meant to be forgotten. Alex stared at him, unable to speak. The book felt impossibly heavy in his hands, and the man's gaze, those dark, knowing eyes, felt like they were peering into his soul, unraveling the very fabric of his existence. "Take it with you," the man said suddenly, his voice sharp now. "Take the book. The story has already begun, and it will find you, whether you read it or not." The air seemed to freeze around them, the world hanging in a delicate balance. Alex felt as though he were standing on the edge of something vast and unknowable. The decision before him was simple, yet it carried an unspoken weight, one that he couldn't fully understand. The man stepped back, his presence retreating like the mist itself. "The choice is yours." And with that, Alex felt the grip of the book tighten, as if the pages themselves were urging him to make his move. He hesitated, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The town of Havenridge, his home, was no longer visible through the mist. The world around him had become distorted, shapeless. The voice that had called to him echoed in his mind, urging him onward. Without another word, Alex took the book in both hands, clutching it tightly as if it might slip away from him. The man, now a mere shadow in the fog, seemed to fade from existence, leaving behind only the oppressive stillness of the mist. The fog thickened, swirling around him in waves, and Alex found himself alone once again, save for the heavy weight of the book and the unsettling sense that something far beyond his understanding was waiting for him. With a final glance toward the place where the man had stood, Alex turned, his mind whirling with thoughts he could hardly grasp. What was the story? What was the choice he had just made? And why had he been the one to hear the call? As he made his way back toward the town, the mist parted before him, revealing the dim outline of the streets of Havenridge. The world felt wrong, as though the very fabric of reality had shifted and warped. Alex didn't know what to expect, but one thing was certain, his life would never be the same again. The book in his hands pulsed with a strange energy, as though it, too, was alive. The first of many steps had been taken. And now, the real story, his story, was about to begin. Alex's mind raced as he walked back through the mist-shrouded streets of Havenridge. The town felt unreal, as if it no longer belonged to the world he knew. The familiar houses, the quiet streets, and the distant sound of dogs barking all seemed distant and unfamiliar now, as though they had somehow been stripped of their meaning. The book in his hands throbbed with a pulse he couldn't explain, like a heartbeat that belonged to something else, something ancient. It felt almost like a living thing, as if it were trying to speak to him, whispering its secrets in a language he couldn't understand. His fingers tightened around it as he walked, his heart hammering in his chest. The streets of Havenridge stretched out before him, but they didn't look the same. The trees that lined the road seemed darker, their branches twisting unnaturally in the fog. The houses, once familiar and comforting, now looked like empty shells, haunted by the ghosts of a past he couldn't quite place. He turned down a side street, heading for his small apartment above a local cafe. As he walked, he tried to push the man's words from his mind, but they lingered like a shadow at the edge of his thoughts. Not all stories are meant to be forgotten. The weight of those words pressed down on him. What had he done by taking the book? Had he been right to listen to the man, to take something so strange and unknowable into his hands? He didn't have answers, only more questions. And with each step, those questions grew heavier, suffocating him with their weight. As he reached the entrance to his building, Alex glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the man standing in the fog, watching him. But the street was empty, the mist thickening around him like a wall. He hurried up the stairs and unlocked the door to his apartment, stepping inside with a sense of urgency. The apartment was small, cluttered with books, old furniture, and bits of forgotten history. It was a place that had once been his sanctuary, his refuge from the world. But tonight, it felt different. The air was thick, heavy with the strange energy that had followed him from the clearing. He set the book down on the small table by the window and stood over it, his eyes tracing the worn cover as if it were some kind of puzzle he had to solve. There was a strange stillness in the room, a quiet that felt wrong, as though time itself had stopped. Alex sat down in the worn chair opposite the table, staring at the book. He couldn't bring himself to open it, not yet. There was something in his gut telling him that whatever was inside would change everything. The minutes stretched into hours as he sat there, lost in thought. Outside, the mist continued to creep along the streets, rolling like an ocean tide, swallowing up the town. It was as if the fog itself had taken on a life of its own, curling and shifting, moving with purpose. The faint sound of wind whispered through the cracks in the window, but even that seemed muffled, as though the world outside had become distant and muted. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. A knock at the door. Alex's heart skipped a beat. Who could it be? He hadn't been expecting anyone. His eyes flicked to the book, then back to the door. For a moment, he considered ignoring it, pretending he hadn't heard. But something urged him to answer. He stood up, his legs stiff from sitting too long, and walked to the door. His hand hovered over the handle, a sense of unease rising in his chest. With a quick motion, he turned the knob and pulled the door open. No one was there. But there, on the floor, was a small package wrapped in plain brown paper. It was tied with a piece of twine, and there was no return address, no name, no clue as to who might have left it. Alex bent down slowly, his fingers brushing the package. There was something about it, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He glanced around, expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but the hallway was empty. He picked up the package and closed the door behind him. As he walked back to the table, his mind raced. Who would leave something like this on his doorstep? And why now? Could it be connected to the book? To the strange man in the fog? His hands trembled as he untied the twine and peeled back the paper. Inside, there was another book, smaller than the first, its cover black and smooth, with no title, no markings. It looked almost new, pristine compared to the first book, which was weathered and old. Alex's fingers hovered over the cover, the same strange feeling of unease creeping over him. He opened the book carefully, his eyes scanning the first page. The words were written in a language he didn't recognize, swirling symbols that seemed to move on the page, shifting as he tried to focus on them. A cold shiver ran down his spine as he realized something that had been lurking at the back of his mind but that he had been unwilling to face until now. These books were connected. They weren't just random objects. They were part of something larger, something that spanned time and space. And now, Alex was caught in the middle of it. He slammed the book shut, his breath coming fast and shallow. The air in the room had grown colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch, twisting and warping in the dim light. The faint sound of whispers filled the space around him, growing louder, more insistent. He could hear them now, voices, distant but clear, calling out to him. He wanted to run. He wanted to leave, to forget everything, to never have seen the man in the fog, to never have taken the books. But he couldn't. The whispers, the call of the books, it was too strong. It was too late to turn back now. The mist outside pressed closer to the windows, its tendrils curling around the edges of the glass like fingers reaching for him. And Alex knew, deep down, that the story was just beginning. Alex's apartment felt like a prison now, every corner suffocating him. The darkness seemed to press in, warping the room, making the walls seem as though they were closing in. The temperature had dropped drastically, and his breath came out in visible puffs, the air thick with something unnameable. The whispers had grown louder, now echoing in his mind, as if the very air around him was speaking to him in a language he couldn't understand but that somehow felt familiar. He couldn't stay in this place any longer. The walls felt like they were watching him, listening to him. The book, the small black one, sat on the table like an ominous presence, taunting him. He had to do something, but what? What could he do? He'd never been the type of person to believe in superstition, in ghosts, or in any of that nonsense. He'd always prided himself on being a realist. But now, faced with something he couldn't explain, he found himself questioning everything he knew. For the first time in his life, Alex felt truly powerless. He couldn't stop the whispers, the nagging voices in his head that urged him to open the book again. To look deeper, to understand what it was trying to tell him. But every instinct he had screamed at him not to. He had already made a terrible mistake by taking the book in the first place. And yet, here he was, unable to walk away, unable to stop himself from being drawn further into its grip. His hands trembled as he reached for the book. The cover felt cold, unnaturally cold, as if it had absorbed the chill from the fog outside. He opened it, and once again, the strange symbols greeted him, twisting and writhing on the page. The whispers grew louder, becoming clearer, and Alex felt a pull, a tugging sensation deep in his chest. The words, though still foreign, began to make sense. Not in a logical, conscious way, but in a primal, instinctual way. They were calling to him, speaking directly to his soul. The room seemed to darken as the words on the page shifted. They began to form shapes, images of things that didn't belong, visions of forgotten places, twisted landscapes, and shadowy figures that moved in and out of sight. The mist outside was now visible through the window, creeping across the streets like some living, breathing entity. It pressed against the building, pushing its way in, its cold tendrils reaching through the cracks of the old structure. A knock on the door startled him, and he slammed the book shut, his heart racing. It took him a moment to gather his composure before he opened the door cautiously. To his surprise, no one stood there. Instead, there was a slip of paper, rolled up tightly and tied with a string, lying on the floor. Alex's fingers shook as he bent down and picked it up. The paper was old, yellowed with age, and the handwriting on it was familiar, too familiar. It was the same script as the one in the book, the same twisting symbols that seemed to shift and change as he looked at them. He had seen these symbols before, on the pages of the first book, and in the strange visions he had begun to experience. The note was addressed to him, written as though it were meant to warn him. "You are not alone." The words echoed in his mind, the realization dawning on him with a sudden clarity that left him breathless. He wasn't alone. Someone, or something, was watching him, guiding him, pulling him into this madness. He stepped back, closing the door slowly, his mind racing. The whispers had stopped, but the sense of dread remained, thick in the air like a fog he couldn't escape. He moved to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to see outside. The mist had grown thicker, swirling in unnatural patterns, moving like a slow tide. And there, just at the edge of the fog, he saw a figure. A man, standing motionless, his features obscured by the mist. Alex's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the figure. He couldn't make out the man's face, but something about him felt wrong. The man seemed to be waiting, watching. And in that moment, Alex realized with a sinking feeling that he had seen this figure before. He had seen him in the clearing, back when he had first encountered the book. The man had been there, just beyond the trees, watching him as if he were the one pulling the strings, guiding Alex's every move. With a trembling hand, Alex reached for the book again, unable to stop himself. The desire to understand, to know what it all meant, was too strong. He opened the pages, his eyes scanning the text once more. The symbols danced on the page, their meaning becoming clearer. They weren't just words. They were instructions, rituals, ways to reach beyond the veil of reality. The figure outside moved, taking a step forward, disappearing into the mist, as if beckoning Alex to follow. And despite every ounce of fear in his body, despite the warnings that screamed in his mind, he knew what he had to do. He had to go. He had to find out what this was all about, or he would never have peace. He was already too far in. He couldn't turn back now. With the book in hand, Alex left the apartment, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. The mist had thickened around him, and he could feel the presence of the fog closing in, wrapping around him like a shroud. The street was empty, the town eerily silent, save for the sound of his own breathing and the distant, indistinct whispers that seemed to come from all directions. He followed the path he had taken earlier, toward the edge of town, toward the clearing where the man had been. The fog seemed to pull him along, guiding him, as though it knew where he was meant to go. The streets blurred, the familiar landmarks lost in the swirling mist. And then, just ahead, he saw the figure again. The man was standing in the clearing, waiting for him. His silhouette was barely visible against the fog, but Alex could feel his gaze, even from this distance. As he approached, the man didn't move, didn't speak. He simply stood there, his figure half hidden by the mist, as though he were part of it. The air around them seemed to hum with energy, charged with something that Alex couldn't explain, something ancient and powerful. The man raised his hand slowly, a silent gesture for Alex to come closer. Without thinking, Alex obeyed, walking toward him, his steps measured and heavy. When he was just a few feet away, the man finally spoke, his voice low and raspy, as though it had not been used in a long time. "You've come to understand, haven't you?" Alex didn't respond, but the question hung in the air, unanswered. The man smiled faintly, his eyes gleaming in the darkness. "You've already seen the truth," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It was never just about the books. It's about the story, Alex. The story that binds us all together. And now, you are part of it." The figure before him seemed to stretch and warp in the mist, its presence an unnerving contrast to the stillness of the world around them. Alex stood there, his body frozen, a chill creeping through him that had nothing to do with the temperature. The man's eyes were gleaming now, unnatural in their intensity, and Alex felt as though they were piercing through him, searching, knowing things he wasn't ready to face. "You think you can understand it, don't you?" The man's voice was smooth, almost mocking. "You think you can unravel what's been woven for centuries, what's already been set in motion? But you're wrong. You've only just begun to see. The question is, will you accept what you find? Or will you turn away?" Alex couldn't speak. His throat felt tight, as though something was constricting it, an invisible force suffocating him. He had come here to find answers, to understand the whispers, to make sense of the chaos that had taken over his life. But now, in the presence of this man, this being, for Alex couldn't bring himself to call him human, he realized he wasn't sure he wanted the answers anymore. The man took a slow step toward him, his movement fluid, unnerving. The air around them seemed to hum, thickening with an energy that Alex couldn't comprehend. The mist parted as the man moved, swirling and shifting, almost as if it were alive. It wasn't just fog anymore, it was something else, something ancient, something vast. It stretched beyond what Alex could see, beyond what he could understand. "You've felt it, haven't you?" the man continued, his voice drawing Alex in. "The weight of the book. The way it calls to you. How it whispers to you in the quietest hours, how it pulls you into its web. This isn't just a book. It's a doorway. And you've opened it." Alex wanted to step back, to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He was paralyzed, both physically and mentally. The words, the man's presence, it was like a spell woven around him, keeping him rooted to the spot. "The doorway between worlds, between realities," the man said, his smile widening. "And now, you've crossed it. You've seen what others haven't. You've touched the edge of something far older than you can possibly fathom." Alex's mind raced. The man's words didn't make sense, but at the same time, they did. He could feel it, deep in his bones, the truth. There was something else, something beyond what he had known, and it was waiting for him. It was as though his entire life had been leading him to this moment. "You have a choice," the man said, his voice suddenly calm, almost soothing. "You can close the door. You can leave. Walk away and pretend none of this ever happened. But it will always be with you. The knowledge, the awareness, it can never be undone. Or you can embrace it. Accept what you've seen, what you've learned, and walk through the doorway." The words hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. Alex felt as if the ground beneath him was shifting, like the very fabric of reality was warping. He looked down at the book in his hands, its pages still open, still waiting. He could feel the weight of it again, the pull, like it was drawing him towards something he wasn't ready for. "What happens if I go through?" he finally asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. He didn't know why he asked. It was like he was compelled to. Like the answer didn't matter because it had already been decided. The man's smile faded, his expression growing serious. You'll see things you cannot unsee. You'll know things you cannot unknow. And once you've crossed, you can never come back. There is no going back from what you will learn. There is no undoing what you'll become. Alex's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what the man meant. He didn't understand. But the book, the figure, the mist, it all felt connected. He could feel the pull of it in every fiber of his being, an undeniable urge to take the next step. For a moment, everything was still. Time seemed to stretch out, bending around him as he stood there, caught between two worlds. He looked at the man, then down at the book, then back at the fog that surrounded them. Everything in him screamed to turn away, to leave it behind. But something deeper, something he didn't understand, urged him forward. And as the man's eyes locked onto his, Alex knew there was no turning back. He took a step forward, then another. The mist parted before him, swirling as if to clear his path. The air grew heavier with every step, thick with the weight of the unknown. The book in his hand seemed to pulse, a rhythm he could feel deep within himself, as though it had a life of its own. The man stood silently, watching him, his smile almost approving now. "You've made your choice," he said softly. "Welcome to the truth." As Alex crossed the threshold, the world around him seemed to shift. The mist thickened, becoming almost tangible, wrapping around him like a shroud. The ground beneath his feet seemed to tremble, and a low hum vibrated in the air, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. Then, just as quickly, it stopped. Everything was still. And Alex realized, with a sinking feeling in his chest, that he had crossed into something far beyond what he had ever imagined. The air felt different, charged, as if it were filled with 1,000 whispers that pressed against his mind. The fog had cleared, but in its place was something far worse, a vast emptiness, a void that seemed to stretch on forever. He could no longer see the man. He could no longer hear the whispers. But he felt them all around him, in the air, in the very fabric of his being. The book in his hands burned with an intensity that almost hurt, and for the first time, Alex realized what he had truly done. He hadn't just opened a book. He hadn't just crossed a threshold. He had unlocked something ancient, something that had been waiting for him. And now, there was no going back. The world he had known, the life he had lived, was gone. The truth had consumed him, and there was nothing left but the empty expanse of whatever lay beyond. The doorway had closed behind him, and Alex was left with only one choice: to accept what had been awakened, or to disappear into the mist.